For this video, I'm going to be going through each of the green rare cards from Mythgard's core set, and I'm going to be talking about which ones I would recommend crafting if you're a new player who wants to play green, and which ones also see play, even if they're in some niche decks, and if they are seeing play, what are those niche decks doing, what are they trying to accomplish. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the intro, so we're going to just dive right in. And first up we have House Elf. This is a 1-drop, and it's okay. Deals 1 damage to your opponent whenever one of their minions attacks. It can be very good in certain control decks, but the reality is it just does not see a lot of play. In fact, I cannot remember the last time this was actually played against me, and as such I cannot recommend crafting this if you are a new player. Next up we have Marching Orders. This is one of those cards that I think at first glance, if you're a new player, just doesn't look very good, but it actually does see play, and it can be very, very strong, specifically in aggressive or mid-rangey lists. There was, for a time, a red-green list running around, for example, and this was played in that, because being able to shift a player's minions and enchantments as far to the right or the left as possible also means freeing your bodies up from blockers. So if you're playing an aggressive deck, and let's just say hypothetically, you stack the left side of the field, your opponent plays some blockers, you can shove them all the way to the right and then continue pushing damage to your opponent. So this is a card that does see play. I don't think it's a must craft for new players, but it's not the kind of card that you're never going to see played, and it's certainly the sort of card that you don't want to own 0 copies of, because you will probably include it at some point, but I don't think it's a must craft. Born Again, this is a card that looks really innocuous at first glance, but this is actually on my must craft list for green. I don't think I play a green deck that doesn't run 2 copies of Born Again. This is just a 2-cost 2/1, but it returns to your hand from the Boneyard at the end of your turn, and that is forever. And because that text remains on the card even when it's in the Boneyard, even suppressing this and then killing it does not prevent this from happening. The only way you get rid of a Born Again, if you're dealing with it, like if your opponent has a Born Again, is by banishing it, or like you can make them ephemeral and then destroy it or bounce it to their hand so that it doesn't actually go to the Boneyard, but that's it. So this is a very kind of annoying card because it is great at just always showing up. Like you play it, and sometimes it attacks for 2 and it helps you in aggressive decks. In control decks, it kind of gives you a continuous stream of blockers because you can play it, and then if it blocks and it dies on your opponent's turn, and then it comes back to your turn, at the end of that turn you get it back. So it's kind of like it's on a loop where you get it back to your hand like every other turn, essentially, at least on average. And it's just a very good card at extending your resources because you keep getting it back. It just boomerangs over and over. It's good. So it looks really innocuous, right? It's just a 2 for a 2/1, no keywords, nothing like that. But believe me, I do not play green decks where I'm not running Born Again. Next up is Garden of Eyrie. I believe that's how it's pronounced. I might be slaughtering that. It might be like Eyrie or something, but nonetheless, this is a card that I think I would label as like an honorable mention. I play this in many of my green control decks. It doesn't usually see play in aggressive lists because you're essentially paying 2 to do nothing, and in aggressive lists you don't typically burn many cards above 4, 5, or 6 mana. So stuff going back to your hand and then becoming more expensive is the same as just never playing them ever again anyway. But in control lists, this is amazing. For example, being able to get multiple uses out of your Harvester or a Sapo if you're playing like green-yellow control is massive. So this card is very good. You will run into it from time to time, and I would consider an honorable mention because in certain decks it's great, but I wouldn't recommend it as just a blanket must craft for new players because it's not going to see play in like all of your green decks like Born Again does, for example. Next up we have Samus the Living Sword. This basically sees play in Fires of Creation decks. As I said in a previous video, the yellow-green Fires of Creation deck is a deck that you will run into from time to time. and that deck runs a lot of artifacts to trigger Fires of Creation, and this is another tool. And you get a lot of value out of Samus in that because you're typically also repairing your artifacts throughout the course, and so you get more than just the standard use out of this. So it does see play there, but if you're not going to be building that specific deck, I don't recommend crafting it. Similarly, Spell Flux Cauldron is also played in that Fires of Creation deck, and it's also sometimes played in like a Swarm deck. There is a couple of decks where you try to go wide, and then you use Spell Flux to kind of boost your board. It is only until end of turn, but even if you, for example, have 3 minions on the field and you play 2 spells, then you basically gave yourself plus 6 damage on top of whatever your spells did. So there is a non-Fires of Creation list that this gets run in. This, in my opinion, puts this into like honorable mention territory, just like Garden, because it does see play in multiple decks, but I don't know if I would call it a must craft. I would wait and, if you're targeting those decks, then yeah, craft it, but it's not like Born Again status. Academy Analyst. I've really only seen this played in the spell heavy green deck. There is a like turbo spell green deck that also uses Bella and Sablewing, the dragon that gets bigger whenever you play a spell, and it sees play there. Outside of that, the 1/4 stat line, even with Lurker, is typically just not good enough, and while Divination 4 is nice, it doesn't also then draw you the card, so you're really just kind of... I mean, it's okay. Like, you give yourself like a Sensei's Divining Top ability if you're an old Magic veteran, you know what I'm referring to there. But for the investment, it's just typically not very good. Leshi Green. This is a 3-cost, and it's created with strength and health equal to the number of minions in play, including itself. Earlier I mentioned with Spell Flux Cauldron, there was like a go wide tokeny deck that Spell Flux is played in. Leshi Green is played in that same deck, so if you're building that deck, then you will craft Leshi Green. But as a blanket general purpose green rare, it's not something I would recommend crafting, so just pay attention to the decks that you're building. Night Hag. This card is interesting. It looks like it should be much better than it is. So 2/4 for 3 is not great, but it's not terrible. On Awaken, the minion in the opposite lane is stunned until Night Hag moves or leaves play. So you can kind of like permanently lock something down. But being that it's a 2/4, it's pretty easy to get rid of Night Hag. And being that it's a 2/4, it doesn't typically trade well into whatever comes across it. In practice, this ends up being worse than the Luchador in yellow, right? So Libre, in my opinion, is just a strictly better card because you get a 3/4, and even though it's only a stun for 1 turn, the 3/4 typically means it trades better into whatever you are stunning. So it's rare that you play Night Hag and then you just sit there and you do nothing. I think Night Hag would go up 1,000,000 times in value if it also had Agile, because it would allow you to stun something and then still attack the opponent. But as of right now, like, it stuns something and then it either sits there and does nothing, or it tries to trade into whatever it stunned, in which case it's just a worse Luchador. So I'm not a big fan of this as is, and I wouldn't recommend crafting it. Vedma Skyranger. This is a card that if you are playing aggro or mid-range that is remotely heavy in green, even if you're like 50-50 split, you want this card. This is a very good card because the gem cost does not require mana. So let's just say, for example, if you're playing mono green, then on turn 3 you can totally play this, spend your other gems, and this immediately gets Agile and Rush. Agile is a very powerful keyword. Rush is a very powerful keyword. Also, the fact that this has Lurker means you can sometimes protect this as well. It's a very good card. It does see play in certain aggressive and mid-rangey lists. And as such, it's like in my honorable mention category. I don't think it's a must craft, but it's pretty close. And honestly, bit of a spoiler alert here, green doesn't have truly many must crafts. In fact, like, if I'm going to be completely honest, I think Born Again is the the only true staple, like, you're going to play this in every green deck you play card. All of the other ones are for specific deck archetypes. So Sky Ranger is pretty high on my list as a result. Bald Mountain. This card is very good. You should expect to run into Bald Mountain. In fact, it's so good, there's a chance it might be nerfed or adjusted at some point in the future. However, it's not played in every green deck. So what I would say is, if you're a new player and you're going to play any sort of green-based spell deck or green-based control deck, absolutely craft Bald Mountain. It is insane. But if you're going to be playing a mid-range or like an aggressive list or some sort of hybrid, then Bald Mountain likely doesn't fit into your deck. But Bald Mountain is so powerful in the decks that it is ran in that it almost becomes must craft as a result. It is very, very strong. If you play like green-yellow control, for example, being able to essentially take your deck from having 2 Misanthropias to 4, because you can bring them each back one time, is massive. It's so huge and so powerful. Saverin Architect. This one is interesting. A 2/6 for 5 isn't terrible. Lurker certainly makes it better. And the ability to kind of endlessly create 2/2s for free, especially ones with Agile, because that's a powerful keyword, seems like it should be better than it is. I have seen it ran as like a 1 or a 2 of in certain mid-range lists as a top end. Again, like you play this and then you just keep playing 2/2s till they deal with it, and then you play the rest of your stuff. It's kind of like a resource generator, a resource extension in many ways, but I don't think it's so good that it's a must craft. And in fact, even the decks that you would put this in, they get along just fine without it. It's not like a linchpin kind of rare, so it's good. Know that it exists, but I don't think it's a must craft by any means. Alkanost. 6/6 for 6. Stats are entirely reasonable. Lurker, which is interesting on a big body like that. And for 2, you can give another minion sacrifice at end of turn unless it attacked or was just created. So basically, it's used to taunt opposing minions. You say, okay, this minion has to attack or else it's just going to get destroyed. It's a cool concept, but it's just not really needed. It's not used in any deck archetypes right now. So more often than not, this ends up just being a 6/6 for 6, which is just not good enough. As such, I don't recommend crafting it. Next up, we have Indirect Beast. This is very much like Bald Mountain. The decks that want to run this really want to run this, and as such, it's almost on my must craft. I would probably say it's a must craft green, just like Bald Mountain, simply because there are not many staple true must craft green cards, right? There's Trusty Born Again, and then there's not much else as far as true must crafts. So in my mind, Indrik kind of falls into that. Indrik is very good in Reanimator. Warded is insane. Overrun is insane. This is a 9/7 body with 2 of the best keywords in the game. It is amazing. And even in decks that are not Reanimator, you sometimes see this included as a 1 of. I've actually even seen it as a 2 of in some cases, but you'll sometimes see it as a finisher in late game decks, because even paying 8 for it, this card ends up being worth it in many cases. It's very, very strong. Once it hits the board, it's very annoying to deal with and get rid of. So the decks that want to run this really want to run this. It's just like Bald Mountain. Is Bald Mountain played in absolutely every green deck? No. But the ones that do want to play Bald Mountain really want Bald Mountain, and the same is said for Indirect Beast. So in many ways, these kind of become must crafts as a result. And then the last one is Plague Maidens. Canine Cavalry was already reviewed in a previous video. So Plague Maidens, this one is interesting because it allows you to deal 1 damage to all minions and players as much as you want. You can spend 1 mana over and over and over again, doesn't even cost gems, and do that as much as you want. Now it has regen 1, so you kind of get to do it for free once per turn. But then after that, it starts taking damage. So if you've got other ways to increase its regeneration, maybe it's on a Bemeni Falls, maybe you're also running Mend and you're going to spend some of your mana to then turn around and heal, then you can do it multiple times. It caps naturally at 3 because it has got 3 health, and after that it dies, so you can't just, put this in play and then activate it like 8 times, for example. But if you have ways to boost its health, and this is, after all, a green and yellow card, so things like Olama Ring, etc., then you can activate it more. There is a cheeky deck that runs this and a few other similar effects to kind of control the board, but it's not very good, and it's certainly not very popular, so you will likely not run into Plague Maidens often, and I certainly don't think that this is a must craft by any means. So if you made it this far, quick recap. The only true must-craft green rare, in my opinion, for a new player is Born Again, because you will play this in basically every green deck you make. After that, the next closest ones are Bald Mountain and Indirect Beast, because the decks that do want to run these really want to run these, but that's not like every green list, so they're list specific. And then my last two honorable mentions, like if I had to pick them, would be Sky Ranger and Marching Orders, because in many ways they're like the opposites of Bald Mountain and Beast. Bald Mountain and Beast, very good late game / combo decks. Sky Ranger and Marching Orders are typically in your aggressive or mid-range green lists, and Born Again just goes in everything. And so those would be like my top 5 as far as the green rares go, and that's it. So if you made it this far and you've listened to my rambling all the way to this point of the video, thank you. You're a saint, and hopefully you'll consider subscribing and sticking around for future videos.